Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, depends on time zone where you are. It's a Ukrainian show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today our guests are Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Oh, thank you, Sasha.
Ivan Kucherenko from Kyiv, Ukraine. Welcome to the show, Ivan.
Hello, Sasha. Hi, Jonathan.
Okay.
Hello, everyone.
Why don't we start today with the video that you prepared for us, and we'll take a look, and then we'll talk.
Let's start with it.
Okay.
On the political map of the world, Russia is a seasoned criminal. But for many years, President Putin has tried to save face in front of other world leaders and to convince the global community that he had good intentions.
В наши планы не входит оккупация украинских территорий. Мы никому и ничего не собираемся навязывать силой.
His press service filtered everything he said in public. His statements were carefully proofread, polished, and edited. And if he suddenly made a mistake, his blunders were edited. He denied any form of aggression, interventionism, occupation, or annexation, and often simply dismissed the fact that his armies were stationed on the territories of other countries.
Их там нет.
But by now, the whole world has realized who Putin really is. Having taken note of his impunity, he started a full-scale war in 2022 in Europe. It then no longer made sense to pretend to be a good guy. Confessions of crimes began to appear in his statements more and more often. Over 11 months, almost a year of war, Putin has resorted to outright threats.
Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
Gas blackmail.
Мы что ли отказываем в поставках? Мы не будем действовать себе в ущерб.
Nuclear rhetoric.
Россия одна из ведущих ядерных держав, но по некоторым компонентам по современности даже многих опережает.
And even admitted to having committed crimes against humanity.
Сегодня утром по предложению Министерства обороны и по плану Генерального штаба России нанесен массированный удар высокоточным оружием большой дальности воздушного, морского и наземного базирования по объектам энергетики.
Attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure are aimed exclusively at the civilian population, since civilians suffer from accidents at power plants during the cold season first and foremost. On top of that, the missiles or their fragments are not quite precise.
Много шума по поводу наших ударов по энергетической инфраструктуре соседней страны. Да, мы делаем это.
According to political experts, law enforcement officers, and historians, Putin's hands were untied by many years of impunity. Quote, governments should ask what the situation would be if they had held Putin to account in 2014, at the onset of the war in eastern Ukraine, or in 2015 for abuses in Syria, or even earlier for the escalation of human rights abuses in Russia over the last decade. Human Rights Watch 2022 report.
Ну что ж на это скажешь?
Realizing the fatality of the mistake in relations with Putin is a good thing. But this is what is happening in Ukraine every day. Infrastructure is being destroyed, ecology is being decimated, and civilians continue to die. And the criminal giving orders continues to enjoy his indemnity.
Все должны знать, что мы-то по большому счету всерьез пока еще ничего и не начинали.
Recognizing your mistake puts you on the path to solving it. The first step has been made. Time for the next one. Creating a tribunal for Russia. Evil must be punished.
Ivan, thank you so much. It's a very, very effective video. And it raises many questions which I would like to address one by one. The question number one is Putin and Russia or both? Because basically it's the same thing, but there is one entity and yet another, although it's exactly the same, more or less. Are they really feel that they can do anything what they want without any punishment? Because it appears to be so. Let's see, even where at the end of the video, they're pronounced that there should be a tribunal for Russia and so on. Do you think that Putin and his criminal bodies, do you think they really worry about the international tribunal? I don't think so. I really don't. In fact, what I'm becoming aware is that Putin wants to prolong this war as long as possible, not even 2 years or 5, but even 10 years. And what's really happening is that it creates the climate of uncertainty right in the middle of Europe, and therefore in the whole world. Now he's playing for the time that at the end of 24 there will be presidential election in the United States. So the maybe not only just Republicans, but maybe even Trump himself will become the next president. And as he said many times before, he would immediately terminate any help to Ukraine. So with the US help out, then Europeans, some of them will continue to help, some of them may not. So it will be a very different ball game. So with all these uncertainties, the only way what West should have done so far is to bring as many weapons to Ukraine as possible in this shortest period of time, and stop talking about that, well, this requires so much training and this requires that much training. It's all irrelevant. You can train them right on the spot. Right now, just bring the weapons, and that's not happening. So therefore, Ukraine cannot start its decisive attack, because without any proper weapons and ammunition, that attack could become quite risky and may not succeed. And that's the last thing what Ukraine needs. So, Jonathan, to help me out, maybe you will add something.
Okay, first of all, interesting report on the news by Lithuanian intelligence published that they estimate that Russia can keep up its current level, can keep up a high level of attack, at its current levels for another 2 years. Well, that's very interesting. Technically, that might be true. They could continue feeding meat into the meat grinder for another maybe 2 years. What is going to happen? It's not that technically Russia could do this, but the effectiveness of their attacks in terms of being able to inflict superior casualties or damage on the Ukrainians is obviously becoming less with every passing day, with every passing offensive or attempt at a counteroffensive by the Russians. The only result that would happen over the next 2 years is that Russian casualties would continue to escalate. Their effectiveness would become even less over time, and they would lose any counteroffensive the Ukrainians are able to mount during this period. The sooner the better, in my opinion, would have a much more decisive effect upon the Russian defenses. The Ukrainians, in one sense, have less that they need to achieve than the Russians do. The Russians, their objective is obviously to conquer the whole of Ukraine or force large concessions from Ukraine. That is increasingly becoming less of an attainable goal for them. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, if they are able to put together even they shouldn't wait for it until they have absolutely everything they need. They should mount a counteroffensive as soon as reasonably possible from their own estimation. They have exceeded our expectations time after time. And I would assess that the Ukrainians will surprise Russia and the West again by mounting a more effective counteroffensive sooner than many people think. And I would predict also that it would be a counteroffensive not only that would cut off the Crimea from the rest of that narrow pathway that they've got of supply right now to Russia. But the fall of Crimea, I would predict, would be easily foreseeable this year, not next year, and this would put the Russians in an even bigger bad situation than they currently are experiencing. So I don't entirely agree with the assessment of some analysts in the West that are saying that the time is on Russia's side and that they can afford, to just prolong the war. What they are doing, the more they prolong the war in an effort to try and force Ukraine to its knees, the worse off they are going to be when the war finally ends, whether it's by a forced retreat by the Russians from Ukraine or by Russia finally saying, the heck with this, we're declaring victory and going home, so to speak.
Jonathan, here is I'm aware of military analysis by Ukrainians, by experts. Some of them, Ivan, you're probably listening. I will not call names, but what they're saying is, forget about F-16s or even Leopard tanks or all this machinery. Ukrainians badly need the artillery and the
basics.
It's an artillery war more than anything else. And with all the mines that Russian put in the fields or so on, it remains to be seen how Leopards will be effective later on. Hopefully they will. But the most important thing is, even before Leopards will move into attack, you need a lot of artillery and ammunition to soften up the resistance of Russian forces. So after you do that, and this is as old as the Stalingrad fight, remember that it all started in November of 1942 when Russians started bombarded with artillery, Katyusha, this
thousands of pieces of artillery.
It was non-stop. That was demoralized Germans quite a bit. And before the Russians start actual attack with tanks and so on, they were already demoralized. And with the Russian winter there, so on, it was, what was it?
More severe than in many years prior.
Absolutely. Now, what I'd like to turn our attention to is that its source foreign policy, citing a Ukrainian military official speaking on condition of anonymity. Quote, Russia has also begun arming up and digging in for a coming offensive. The Ukrainian military estimates that Russia already has 1,800 tanks, almost 4,000 armored vehicles, 2,700 artillery systems, 810 Soviet-era multiple rocket launch systems such as Grad and Smerch, 400 fighter jets, and 300 helicopters ready for a new wave on attack. Russian officials estimate that Russian forces inside the country have surpassed the 300,000 marks. Now, what's alarming about that is that the longer the war goes on, the more Russians are training their forces. They're becoming more skilled than before. They're changing their formation. So the longer the war goes on, the more skillful Russian army is becoming. Tell me, Ivan, what do you think about it?
Actually, I agree with the Jonathan regarding the resources of Russia. Probably, if you estimate the current resources of Russia for conducting this war and predict that nothing will change, then probably Russia will be able to continue the war within several years. But there is a big question on which data these predictions or these estimations are based, because Russia stopped publishing official data since the last year about their economy status, and I'm not sure that Lithuanian intelligence has possibility to gather better intelligence than Ukrainian intelligence one, and probably this estimation is not obvious as it may be. I agree with Jonathan that as soon as Ukrainian counterattack will begin and Ukraine will cut the Crimea, it will be a way for the occupation Crimea at maximum, and the loss of Crimea will be a big failure to Russia. Or it will create maybe some topic for negotiation with Russia because they will not be able to supply Crimea. Ukraine will have all the possibilities to cut off the supply of Crimea, like water supply, electricity supply, and to attack Russian ships supplying Crimea. And Russia will either have to leave Crimea immediately, or it will be a topic for negotiation with Russia, for instance, for them to go to some agreements with Ukraine and probably claim their loss in this war. So, but to do it, I agree that Ukraine needs not only tanks and not only jet fighters, but also artillery, a lot of ammunition for artillery, a lot of shells, and we are waiting for Western countries to supply us with them.
That's number one. I was listening to one expert, I think, Ivan, we discussed it last time, who believes, he's an Azerbaijani general, and he believes that Ukraine needs 1 million shells every week. And there is no such number of shells produced in all Europe put together. They just don't produce so many shells. So it will require.
They haven't gone to a wartime. They haven't gone to a wartime footing.
Absolutely. And if that was a belief, see, I think most of the doctrines of fighting Russia or Soviet Union at the time was based on the nuclear scenario. That Russia has so many tactical nukes, and the West will meet it with its own nukes or so on. But the real conventional war was, for all these reasons, was almost forgotten. And people never realized that in 21st century, there will be all-out conventional war in in Europe. So everybody is now, I last thing what I heard that they're going to build the artillery factory in Bulgaria, who will do nothing but produce the
they're going to have full employment.
They will have full employment for many years to come, especially if Putin wants to fight this war for the next 10 to 15 years. What's his life expectancy? Is he going to
not if the cancer prognosis or the cancer diagnosis is at all accurate? People in his situation don't have that long a shelf life.
Cannot be
right. Given you just can't predict it. I can't see. I don't think he sees himself as living that long. Which may reflect his degree of desperation.
I would imagine how many people in the world are going during the night or early morning to the internet to check if Putin is still alive.
Reading the obituaries with great anticipation.
Yeah, I think there should be already some obituaries writers should hopefully get
Mark, I remember I told you before, Mark Twain once said, while I would never willingly wish another man's death, there are some obituaries that I would read with great pleasure.
Yeah, I remember there was a movie I saw just recently on Netflix. I forgot actually the name of it, but there was a very funny line. A young man, he was looking for a job, and finally he found a job. He became obituary writer for a local newspaper. And when his friend meets him about, I don't know, 2, 3 years later, he asks him, "So how is your career doing?" He said, "Very well. I became already the head of the department of obituary writers."
Charming.
Charming story.
Just makes me feel so optimistic.
Yeah. Yeah, I never thought about it. Actually, there are
Yeah.
people,
Let's
it's
let,
their
let, let's keep
profession.
let's keep talking about the more cheerful subject, the war in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that is.
Yeah.
You see, this is the problem is, to tell the truth, I'm very frustrated that Putin is allowed to bombardment of the Ukrainian cities, killing people, creating immense, horrific destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure, including power stations and energy. And somehow it is, and it's using very sophisticated armed forces like Kinzhal weapons, and Ukraine has no defense against it. So that goes on, and it doesn't create any alarm in the West that something is really happening what should not happen. And especially, I mean, if it would happen before the West got involved so heavily in Ukraine, okay, that's one story. Okay, so you want a much larger and stronger country is winning the war against a smaller country, and that there is to it. It's a real politics, and that's the end of it. But since West and the United States have committed to be with Ukraine and providing all the assistance and military and weapons and everything else and financial assistance, that doesn't bode well really for understanding the West and US policy toward Ukraine. I'm really getting lost. Jonathan, do you have any better explanation?
Not at this point. It's just
Yeah.
it's just baffling. The But I still maintain that Ukraine has some more surprises up its sleeve. So I'm going to be watching the events in March and April with great interest, and that I think the Ukraine is going to surprise both Russia and the West with an effective counteroffensive
There
sooner
is,
than anyone expects.
I was looking at one video, and there was a very elegant plan of Ukraine to attack, but not at the Melitopol line, but even farther east from Melitopol. And that would, if successfully, that would cut all Russian military in the eastern, southeastern front in two, and one which is from west from that line up to Kherson, that would be devastated. That would be cut short of supply, and it would be just a question of time when it will be decimated. And that opens Crimea right away. So if that is a plan, I think it's quite doable. I think it's a
I
very
agree.
interesting plan. Yeah. Ivan, what do you think?
Yeah, unfortunately, or probably luckily, no one knows where Ukraine exactly will counterattack, and
And that's for
we are
obvious reasons. Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
They want to keep us in the dark just as much as they want to keep the Russians in the dark, which is probably a good thing.
Yeah, and there are several versions where this counterattack may start. But what is obvious in every case that Russia doesn't have enough resources to control the depth of all occupied territory. They are keeping their troops on the close to the front lines, but they're not able to put them all over the occupied territory. And as soon as Ukraine will strike through the front line, and this is why we have so vitally require artillery to prepare the strike and tanks to go through the Russian front line, then it will be quite easy to advance through the occupied territory. And we've seen this already during the occupation of Kharkiv region, when Russian troops were so frightened of Ukrainian counterattack that they retreated almost to Russia, not only from Kharkiv region, but they've left half of Lugansk region, and they really were going to retreat to Russia, and Ukraine unfortunately just didn't have enough troops and enough resources to advance further that time. And Ukrainian army had to stop on some positions, but in case our army had enough resources to advance further, probably there was the occupation not only of Kharkiv region, but of Lugansk region as well, because Russians were really frightened. My friends who are serving on the front line, on the battlefield, and they also told me that Russians can attack only by gathering a huge amount of soldiers, like coming with an horde. And as soon as they feel the power, as soon as they their counterattack, as soon as they confront the greater power, they immediately retreat, they flee. And this is the issue that and the big difference between Russian army and Ukrainian army. Ukrainian army stays on our positions, and the Russian can't capture city of Bakhmut for almost a year. And Russian army flees when they see greater power is coming.
Ivan, do you know what's happened lately with Prigozhin? Prigozhin has been denied any ammunition by Russian army, and his telephone lines to the commanders of Russian army, they were all cut off. So he's in complete isolation without any weapons, and it remains to be who is first to going to capture him, Ukrainians or Russians. I think he would prefer to be captured by Ukrainians.
Yes, I think he would too. The interesting thing with Bakhmut in some ways is resembling more and more the Battle of Verdun in World War I. The Germans had intended the Battle of Verdun to bleed the French white. As it turned out, the Germans sustained almost as many casualties as the French did, and so it didn't really have the decisive effect they were hoping for. However, in this version of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians are inflicting a much superior level of casualties on the Russian army. So in that case, it's better than Verdun. And the Ukrainians have also been forward-looking in that they are building defensive lines to the west, immediately to the west of Bakhmut, to minimize the impact of any. If the Ukrainians decide to withdraw eventually from Bakhmut, the potential by the Russian army will be minimized, and they will still just confront yet another defensive line. If you look at a map, another thing that this Battle of Bakhmut reminds me of is the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive by the Germans in World War II in December 1944. If you look at a map of that, the most decisive city within that battlefield zone was the town of Bastogne. If you look at that map, and you would see that the town of Bastogne resembles a spider web with numerous roads radiating outward from it, that it was obvious that in order for the German offensive to succeed, they would have to have Bastogne. And that's why the American 101st Airborne basically held that city and until reinforcements could arrive. And in this case, the Ukrainians, quite correctly, are holding Bakhmut for as long as possible, inflicting maximum casualties on the Russian army. And it still remains to be seen whether the Russians will be able to take Bakhmut at all. So,
Actually, Bakhmut, if you look at the map, which I did, Bakhmut is a very important point that if Ukrainians will be able to hold it, it is where the counterattack of Ukrainians will start with the reinforcement of fresh army forces. That's an excellent point where they can march almost in any direction and inflict a very, very big surprise for Russians.
almost like Bastogne, almost as valuable as Bastogne was. So,
Absolutely, yeah, it's a very, very good parallel. Thank you so much for participation in today's program. We are following with our eyes and ears and hearts everything what's happening in Ukraine these days, and hopefully we'll have some really, really good news and very soon. Thank you so much, and see you on Tuesday. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.